Hello and welcome back. I'm your host, Dr. Raj Balkaran, and it's my delight today to welcome to the podcast Dr. Antonia Ruppel, who is a renowned Sanskritist and a well-known and loved online teacher, among many other hats that she wears. And we'll learn all about those hats in this candid conversation. Antonia, welcome to the podcast.
Hi, Rod. So nice to see you and to hear you.
It's so nice to be seen and heard. Now I've got past passive participles in my head from Sanskrit grammar, but anyhow, story for another day. But,
A very good start to this conversation. I approve.
An auspicious beginning. So for those listening, clearly you've dedicated your life to this language and its various manifestations and iterations and applications. And how did this begin? How did you get into this?
Complete chance. So first of all, I'd like to say I just feel extremely lucky and fortunate that I can basically at this point spend my life living with Sanskrit, working on Sanskrit, thinking about Sanskrit, because it is an utterly beautiful language, and then there's so much wonderful literature in Sanskrit. So both for the linguist in me and for the person who likes to think, I just feel extremely fortunate to be able to spend my life on things that are beautiful and have meaning. I came to Sanskrit as an undergraduate. I did classics, which is Latin and ancient Greek, and we had an introduction to comparative linguistics, or an introduction to, first of all, Latin and Greek linguistics. And my lecturers kept mentioning this thing called Sanskrit. And I figured from the context that Sanskrit apparently was a language. I'd never heard of it before. And at some point, I went to one of my lecturers and said, so what is Sanskrit, and would that be a useful thing to learn? And he then said, oh, Sanskrit is always useful, and gave me his second copy of Michael Coulson's Teach Yourself Sanskrit, and said, here. And so I went away and started teaching myself Sanskrit, which was an interesting experience because, first of all, teaching yourself something without any help just from a book is always a bit challenging. And the challenge in my case was heightened even further by the fact that the 2 pages in the book which had the external sandhi tables were missing. And I didn't notice this at first because basically those pages are so perfectly encapsulated that when you read the last word on the preceding page and the first word on the following page, you don't really notice that there's something missing. And so Sandhi for me was even more mysterious and even more baffling than it is to normal Sanskrit students who actually have the information in front of them. And anybody who's not done Sanskrit before, Sandhi is a way that words change their shape when they come into contact with other words and sentences. And there's lots and lots of intricate rules, and the number of rules and the little details that they involve are baffling when you come in touch with them at first. But they're even more baffling when you're told that there are rules, but you don't get to see the rules. So that was my first beginnings into Sanskrit.
Thank goodness I mute while while speaking while listening to guests, because my laughter would have interrupted you a number of times. I can so relate because my very first Sanskrit course was at the University of Toronto, and although I had an instructor, a lovely, brilliant woman, Libby Mills, we also used Coulson, and even with the instructor, I'm not sure Coulson was the most user friendly for many of its benefits. It was and I can't imagine Sandhi, this for those listening, this sort of illusion of sound. So in English, if we say dogs and cats, dogs, it sounds like GZ or Z, and you would spell it with a Z in Sanskrit. This is what Antonia is talking about. And there's this, it's like chemical compounds. There's a periodic table of how these sounds combine, and it's such a massive aspect and a massive hurdle. So in the one sense, maybe you weren't intimidated because you didn't have to see the Sunday chart, but in the other sense, you had no idea what was going on with why these endings were changing. So That's great. So, and also I really resonate with this notion of being really grateful and fortunate and privileged. In many ways, the language chooses us, isn't it?
Yeah, yes, in a way it does. In many ways it does.
um, and you mentioned at the outset that you find it meaningful and beautiful and it appeals to the linguist in you.
Mhm.
I get the sense it appeals to other aspects of you. When you say beautiful, could you say a bit more about that?
Well, I am just regularly in awe of how many different aspects of human life are addressed in Sanskrit literature. I mean, this is due to the fact that, Panini basically froze the language in time around 2,500 years ago. And so the literature that was written since is written in the same language, unlike in other languages such as Latin or Greek, where you have a few centuries of language and then afterwards the language changes so that you need to learn a new language and your Latin doesn't help you so much anymore. So there's the sheer amount of literature, but completely independently of that, the breadth of what is covered. So we have philosophical texts, we have texts that maybe today we wouldn't think of as philosophy, but as legal texts. There's poetry, there's mathematics, there's pretty much anything that you want. There's short poems, there's long poems, there's plays. And for me, so I grew up in Germany. I went to university in the UK, and then I had my first job in the US. So I've always lived in the West in quotation marks. And I came in touch with the past, so past thoughts, past wisdom, fairly early on because I learned Latin. Latin was my first foreign language, and then I also did ancient Greek in school, and then I continued with these at university. And I just was absolutely fascinated by how in Sanskrit we see many of the same thoughts that I'd first encountered in ancient Greek and then also in ancient Roman philosophers, but with a slightly different twist. And so it was through Sanskrit that I really got to know, or that I really was able to think about what things unite us as humans. So which questions we all ask, and which aspects of our thoughts are culture based. So, for example, when you read the Bhagavad Gita, there is so much in there that I would think is absolutely relevant for everybody. But then there are interspersed these very culture specific thoughts about, this and that then causes the problem that the castes get mixed. And this is a serious problem within the scope of the Bhagavad Gita, but I would say, okay, so what? And it's really fascinating to see that you have things that probably everybody would see as an issue. Oh, look, a war destroys entire families. And then the things that are seen as equally important, equally problematic, equally causing pain and suffering, other people would say, well, but is that really the core part of the problem? And I then went back to some of the ancient Latin and Greek texts that I'd read and saw that things that I'd completely taken for granted that I'd never noticed were of the same nature. Some things are problems for every human. Some things are problems for a human if they've grown up in a specific culture. And I thought that what that was quite, I want to say liberating, but it's potentially liberating because it involves a lot of soul searching and a lot of questioning your assumptions that you didn't even know you held, to then see which issues are issues for everyone and which things I'm just unnecessarily worried about. So there's this kind of getting to know people, getting to know what's human a little better, and just, from a completely selfish point of view, learning what not to worry about is an aspect for me of reading any kind of great literature, but it just so happens that I've spent a particular amount of time in recent years on reading Sanskrit literature. And yeah, sorry, I go on, but when you ask me about Sanskrit literature and why I like it, I always go on for too long. But there's just so much.
All questions are intended to be generative. Said it before, I'll say it again. The tangents are a feature, not a bug of great podcasts. Uh, and also the conversational style, the unscripted. I mean, I'm learning. I'm really, really, truly resonating with what you're saying because it is as if someone is articulating from a different angle something that I too have perceived. When I hear you speak, it sort of, to my mind, it evinces the transformative power of engaging these texts and ideas that stand the test of time. Why else would they stand the test of time if they weren't yet relevant? And so
Mhm.
all texts have sociocultural contexts, and yet many texts have evergreen, perennial, humanistic ideas, the stuff of what we're made of, what we're seeking, and utterly fascinating. I'm currently, it's especially resonating at present. I'm currently teaching a course called Yoga Illumined, where we look at the Yoga Sutras and then we look at the Bhagavad Gita and definitions of yoga and the state of yoga, and then the last module of the course we're looking at, well, what does this mean for us? Like,
Mhm.
we're not cloistered, we're not sequestered, we're not renunciants, we're not in ancient India. How much of this is applicable? Can you, yeah, can you, how do you cease the vrittis in these times? What does this mean for us?
Yeah.
Did the ancient rishis foresee iPhones and and smartphones and all these vrittis, or what? Like, to what extent is this relevant? And so, it really is a beautiful language insofar as serving as a rich repository of profound ideas and works, and it's to my mind, to my heart, it's aesthetically beautiful just hearing it, like
Mm.
it's just designed to sound nice, it seems, at least Sunday, and just it's a very pleasant sounding language. um
Well, if you look at old German grammars, they don't mention the term Sandhi. So old German grammars of Sanskrit, they don't call it Sandhi, they call it euphonic combinations. So euphonic, sounding beautiful.
okay, so it's not just me. If the ancient Germans agree with me, I must be onto something.
Well, not quite ancient. We're just talking about sort of 150 years ago, but yeah.
Okay, maybe ancient in a different way. But um, you mentioned this really cool feature about Sanskrit, where, for example, if you look at English 400 years ago, Shakespearean English is vaguely decipherable, and Chaucerian English is not at all decipherable to modern English speakers. And
Let alone
yet, for
Beowulf.
yeah, well, yeah, who knows what that is? But Sanskrit more or less has remained the same for quite a long time. Could you say a
Mhm.
little bit more about that?
Yeah, so this is, as I say, I come to all of this as a linguist, so as someone who is interested in the language for its own sake, and then I sort of spread from there. But the situation in India was that we had these texts, the oldest texts, which we know as the Vedas. So Veda is Sanskrit for knowledge, and these were the texts that encapsulated the knowledge that you needed to correctly carry out the Vedic sacrifices. So to basically communicate with the gods correctly. And these texts remained important for the culture of the time for several centuries. But the thing is that when you are in a sort of everyday natural situation, language changes. And if you have texts that are crucially important for you and they're several centuries old, then often you don't quite understand them. You don't quite understand what they're saying. And so a grammarian tradition arose. Grammarians are people who try to sum up the rules of a language so that anybody can learn that language. And this tradition culminated in the grammar of someone who we know by the name of Panini. And At least in part, it was Panini's intention to make sure that this older form of the language, which was used in all these seminal and fundamental texts, remained intelligible. But what his grammar was then taken as from around maybe 100 years after his death was not just as a description of what came before, but as a prescription of what was supposed to come. So basically, whenever Panini said, you find this and this and this, and this is kind of the main thing, this is the preferred way of doing it, then that was the way people would do it from now on. And so in effect, we are not sure to what extent that was the intention at all, but the effect of Panini's grammar was that the rules of Sanskrit were basically frozen. And anybody who wanted to write Sanskrit wrote Sanskrit or used Sanskrit, spoke Sanskrit, following the rules of Panini. And so this natural phenomenon of language changing was pretty much stopped. There are some features of the language where you can see that it changes, mostly due to the fact that it came in touch a lot with other languages. So the Dravidian languages that we now find in mostly in the south of India, or almost exclusively in the south of India. So there's some ways in which Sanskrit changed because of that. But for the most part, when you read a text that was written 2,000 years ago and a text that was written 1,000 years ago or 500 years ago, you don't notice the difference. When it comes to more recent Sanskrit texts, then it depends on the levels of skill of the author, because sometimes you look at something and you're really, really, really confused until someone looks over your shoulder and says, yeah, that's exactly how they do it in Hindi, and that just sort of slipped into the Sanskrit. And you're like, okay, sorry, clueless Westerner here. And the older texts, basically only those survived that used beautifully polished Paninian Sanskrit.
What are some of your favorite genres, vignettes, verses, shlokas? I mean, it might be impossible to choose, but perhaps even that you've recently engaged even.
Um, I am a huge fan of the Katha,
Hmm.
which is a relatively long text. It falls into the genre of katha, which is tales or narrative, it's often translated. And it's one of those texts within a text within a text. So we have the idea behind this whole text is that Shiva, the god Shiva, at some point told a beautiful story to his consort Parvati, and one of his servants listened in on it and overheard it. And as punishment for that, this servant was then sent to Earth and got the task to basically spread this story on Earth, to make the story popular, to share it with lots of others on Earth. And this happened not just to him, but also to several others who sort of transgressed, and together they were supposed to make sure that this story wasn't just known, but sort of became well established on Earth. And this story is the so-called Brihat Katha, the great story or long story. And this story is the adventures of a particular prince. And the adventures of this particular prince are kind of the framework. And within that framework, we have lots and lots of little stories told on various occasions. So, for example, someone is waiting somewhere, and to pass the time, they tell each other stories. A little bit like in the Ramayana or also in the Mahabharata. Sometimes someone tells a story to illustrate a particular example and says, well, you shouldn't do this because that would be just like da 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 da. So that's a little bit like the fables in the Panchatantra and the Hitopadesha. And what I like so much about this happening in the Katha is the Katha was, we are fairly certain, composed in Kashmir in around the 11th century. And that would have been an area and a time that was multicultural, multi-religious, multi-faith. In the 11th century, Buddhism would mostly have been gone from India and would have, migrated to other areas. But in Kashmir, there still was Buddhism, and you had this coexistence of Buddhism and Hinduism. And some of the stories are about exactly that. You have this one story where you have a Buddhist father and a Hindu son. The Hinduism was kind of the up and coming religion, and so the son is Hindu and the father is Buddhist, and they clash. And what happens in a situation like that? Then you have completely innocent and not meaningful stories. So, for example, there's this one very short story that's about someone being told to guard a door, and then what does he do? He goes away and has a very nice day and has nice food and meets people, but he's got the door with him, so he's guarding the door. And so and in between you have basically all the kinds of stories that you might ever want, and they're alive, and they're to some extent timeless, and to some extent, of course, very, very time specific. And you just learn so much about people. And to boot, the Sanskrit of this text, so the author of the text basically is really good at describing complex things in a very simple way, so that you don't even notice that actually what you've just read is quite complex. So, if you've got a shloka, you've got this two-line verse, and actually in that two-line verse, 5 actions are described, and that way the action, the plot of a story progresses in a very lively way, progresses very smoothly. And so this combination of really elegant Sanskrit that you can read quite well. I sometimes find the Katha even easier to read than, for example, the epics. Some people would disagree, but you've got this really elegant Sanskrit giving you this manifold, these very varied stories that will always surprise you in where they're going. And I've been reading some of that with my students. We ended, I think, 2 weeks ago, and I'm already looking forward to my next Katha course.
Brilliant. Now, speaking of students, beyond being a brilliant Sanskritist, clearly you're an engaged and, impassioned teacher. Tell us a bit about your interest in teaching and maybe some of the resources and your sort of journey with pedagogy.
Well, we've already mentioned Michael Coulson's Teach Yourself Sanskrit. And for me, that was a brilliant book, because basically, if you already know a little bit of Latin, a little bit of Greek, and a little bit of German, then the book is perfect. But
that's a big if.
Exactly, but that is not the profile for most students of Sanskrit anymore. And it's like that with many resources that were made for European or American students. The background of the typical Sanskrit student has changed, and I would even argue that there is no such thing anymore as the typical Sanskrit student. It used to be, boys from wealthy families from good schools who obviously had done their Latin and their Greek and probably had learned some German or something like that. And now Sanskrit students just have such very diverse backgrounds. And that's why I think it's really important to start Sanskrit textbooks, any kind of Sanskrit pedagogy, from next to zero. In my books, what I use, so I've got English language Sanskrit textbooks. What I use is my students' knowledge of English. I point out to them, look, you know English. In English, you do this and this and this and that. So, for example, in English, I've got 3 forms of a noun. I've got the singular, so for example, cat. I've got the plural, cats. And then I also have this one form, cat apostrophe s. So my cat's litter tray, that I could also replace by the litter tray of my cat. Now, Sanskrit does that exact same thing, but it just does more of it. So we have more endings, and the things that these endings encapsulate, they're just like what in English you have with of my cat, which we've just talked about as alternative of my cats. We have of my cat, for my cat, with my cat, in my cat. There's a lot of mischievousness or something like that, from my cat, by my cat. And then I just show them that they already know what we call the cases. They already know what the cases basically mean, what they do. They already know the concept from English. They already know the concept of endings from English. And then we can build on that. And I've been writing a German language Sanskrit textbook, and I'm doing the exact same thing there. I'm telling people, look, this is what you already know, and this is how you can use that to now learn a new language, which is basically not something completely new. It's just a different face of language, trying to communicate, trying to encapsulate information. You all know at least one German, otherwise I would be able to talk to you in German right now. And now let's learn something slightly different. So that is what I find really important, to understand languages, to understand language so that you can teach a new one. And that's also why this is one of my bugbears when it comes to language pedagogy. In Sanskrit, the language teaching jobs, actually in not just in Sanskrit, also in classics and in other fields, they always go to people who can engage with the culture and with the philosophy and literature and so on. And I'm like, no, if you want someone to teach a language, they need to understand language, no article. You want a linguist. But people don't see it that way. Anyways, I make use of my linguistic training to hopefully be a better language teacher. And you asked about my motivations. Maybe in that respect, I'm a sort of naive idealist, because I think that, when you teach languages, that in itself is very useful, not just because you learn a language, but you also learn how to deal with a really complex set of information. You learn how to test whether something that someone tells you is likely to be right or seems rather unlikely because it just doesn't fit into the system. You learn how to step by step acquire knowledge, acquire understanding of a complex system. And that, I think, is a very important skill to have in especially a world like ours, where you're kind of flooded by information of all kinds at all times. And the famous fake news. You are more able to spot if you have had the experience of spotting wrong information, of spotting, oh, Antonia's made a typo or something like that, in your journey of learning a language. And then beyond the simple language learning, the texts that you're then able to read, I find that if you have seen this very basic fact that people in a completely different time and in a completely different place that maybe you have no firsthand experience of, they actually are people. They are just like you. And wars and violence always depends on somehow considering a group of people or another person less human, not quite like you. And if you have all this firsthand information of, no, actually, these are people, they are just like you and me, what that person says is exactly like what my father tells me all the time, or what this person says, yeah, that reminds me very much of my niece. When you've got that, I think it becomes so much more difficult to be racist, to be bigoted, and so on. It's not sufficient. I think, you can be a classicist, you can be an Indologist, you can be a Keltologist and be racist. But I think it is something that definitely helps in becoming a better person.
Yeah, fascinating and timely. I was just speaking with a good friend. I've known him for decades. We were having lunch over the weekend. I hardly see him these days. It's part of being grown-ups with families and whatnot.
Yes.
But we were chatting about, we years can pass and we will come together and we have very different training and different perspectives, but we will see very soberly the issues at play in the world, and we tend to agree. And we ended up articulating, or I voiced this idea that, you and I seem to discern or understand that there is such a thing as a human family. Like, humanity is not a concept, it's a reality. But
Yeah.
so many people struggle to think of, maybe when the aliens come, it'll be easier. But so many people struggle to actually discern that we're one genome, we're one species. The human experience is more than an expression. It's a shared experience, and so much more unites us in our experience than prima facie differences might suggest. And so it's so fascinating to hear you come at this from your own training and from your own perspectives and insights. So teaching is so important to you. You've created some texts for teaching. Tell us
Mhm.
about the introduction,
Mm.
the introductory text, and the reader. I'm sure listeners will have all of these. Everything we talk about, we'll create links for in podcast notes. But talk about that. Listeners might be interested.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. So my first job was teaching Latin, Greek, and Sanskrit at Cornell University in the US. And the Latin and Greek textbooks I had were really great. And especially the Latin textbooks that I had, I really liked because basically what they did was they introduced original Latin texts, so original plays and philosophical texts and poetry very early on. And I thought, oh, that's really nice. And in Sanskrit, first of all, I tried teaching with Coulson, which didn't go down well at all. Then I tried a couple of other books, and I realized, I'm making so many extra notes, handouts, resources for my students that I might as well try and put them together, make complete the set, so to speak, and put them together into my own textbook. And that's what I did. And what I tried to do there was what I mentioned earlier. So, I don't assume that you have any experience in learning foreign languages. I don't assume that you're a linguist. I don't assume that you know any deeper grammatical concepts. But I also assume that it's really helpful to know some general linguistic concepts. And to the extent to which that's helpful, I'm going to teach you those so that you are able to think about the new things that you are introduced to more easily. And the other thing that I did was I just copied that basically from Learn to Read Latin by Stephanie Russell and Andrew Keller, or is it Andrew Russell? No, it's Stephanie Russell and Andrew Keller, Yale University Press, in case anyone's interested. So I copied their technique of introducing original Sanskrit text really, really early on with grammar notes and with vocab notes. And I thought that that was really important because when you learn a language that has come down to us in the shape of these highly polished, intricately crafted literary texts, you don't have any real texts that you want to read that are simple. And so you need to start with a more complex texts, unfortunately. And some authors basically give you only things that they have composed themselves, that summaries of stories that they wrote or something like that for the entire introductory course, which may be a year or a year and a half. And even people who are very good Sanskritists are not necessarily very good poets. And so the beauty of the language or the beauty of the texts that draws many people to Sanskrit, they don't really have access to until, a year after they've started, or maybe even longer. And I just thought it was very important to show people regularly the beauty that we want to be able to see unfold, to show them that on a very regular, on a weekly basis. And so those were the sort of two guiding principles, try and explain as much as can be explained. Unfortunately, there's still enough left that you can't explain and that you just need to memorize, but explain whatever can be explained. Use linguistic concepts, use also historical linguistic concepts. So talk about language change, wherever knowledge of language change is useful for learning Sanskrit. And that's gone down really well with my students over the years. I'm really pleased with that. And show them original Sanskrit as early as possible. Show them how they can access it from very early on. And so that's my introductory textbook, the Cambridge Introduction to Sanskrit, which is out with Cambridge University Press, hence the Cambridge in the name. And then I felt that I wanted something to build on this book, which then led to my introductory Sanskrit reader. And what I'm doing in that reader is basically what I just described to you, and I'm taking Sanskrit texts and I'm annotating them. But I'm annotating them in a different way. In the textbook have texts that are quite short, so that they're doable, that they can be translated. They're sort of little nuggets by someone who has had a month of Sanskrit or something like that. Whereas the reader is for people who have completed an introduction to Sanskrit and who now want to work on their reading fluency. So you don't want to be faced with a verse in Sanskrit and then have to go, and this is this, and this is that, and this is this, and then you need to look up all these words, and then you need to look up all these forms, and then you need to look up, what kind of sandhi could this be? What kind of compound is this? So the intermediate experience when you read texts and when you're trying to become more fluent so that you read rather than construct and translate, is dominated by having to look things up. And so what I did was I just put all the information that people would normally have to look up. So all the rarer vocabulary, all the difficult to recognize sandhi, all the perhaps difficult to identify compounds and so on. I put those in vocab notes and grammar notes right on the same page as the text. So you get a couple of lines of text, lots of space in between for all your notes, and then underneath vocab and underneath that grammar, so that yes, you'll still have to look up lots of things, but rather than having to go to 7 websites, 15 books and 8 different dictionaries, you just have it all on the same page. You just look down and you go, okay, right. And that, I think, greatly speeds up people's reading. I just had an email from a colleague from the Netherlands who says that he kind of feels the reader has made him superfluous because he tells the students to get on with it and they just get on with it, which of course, made me very happy to hear. And so that's my introductory Sanskrit reader, which is out with Brill. And by the way, Brill have a great problem selling books. You can only buy it at brill.com/Sanskrit in case anybody is interested. So it's not available on Amazon or anything like that. And yes, Amazon is evil, but Amazon is also a very necessary evil. And so I wish that you could just buy the book online, but no, you can't. You can buy it just from the publisher's website. And so that's the books that I've got out so far. And then there's various other books that I'm trying to work on, trying to make use of my particular strengths. So as with my background in linguistics, and basically writing the sorts of books that I wish I had available while I was a language student.
That, from the very first time that I interviewed you some years ago to cover the Cambridge introduction, I was struck from reading it, why I was so taken was, obviously you're a brilliant Sanskritist, but it's written as a highly empathetic human being and teacher, where it's obvious that the author is putting themselves in the shoes of the student. And empathy is not, much of it is congenital, I believe. Obviously, like anything, we can and probably should develop it if we can. But it's not necessarily commonplace among intellectuals who are staring at a crevice of slicing and dicing a particular hair. And no one has everything. So one really appreciates the extent to which you create these resources, both as a Sanskritist and as a teacher, as one who, wow, what do I wish was on the market when I was studying Sanskrit? What's the book that I wish existed? And I think that's a brilliant approach. It took me a long time to realize that of all the hats I wear, the teacher hat was the head, essentially. When I'm speaking, it's teaching. When I'm teaching, it's teaching. When I'm publishing, it's teaching. It took me a long time to really realize that publishing is teaching, in a sense, right? You're sharing what you've learned.
It is, or rather it should be. That's my problem with a lot of research these days, and also things that are not just research but then also published. There is this huge pressure on people to publish research. Also on academics, this is kind of what their jobs depend on. You will get tenure if you've got a certain number of publications and so on. And so often the research is for the point of doing research, not necessarily for the point of, look, I happen to have found this great thing and I want to tell you all about it. I've been to a number of conferences where basically people said, the point of my presentation is to cram as much information as I can into these 15 minutes. It's not necessarily to make, nicely prepare an idea, a thought, an innovation, a new finding, and make it as accessible to the people in the audience, both those who are new and those, hello, kitty cat, sorry. No. Both those who are new and those who are seasoned professors, bringing in as many people as possible, interesting people in my field, getting them more interested, getting them active in the field. No, so often the point is gatekeeping. So often the point is showing, look, here I am, sort of beating your chest. And I find that sad. Well, I find that sad and again counterproductive because I think it's really important that we've got the arts and humanities in society, and I find it important that they're not something that is just left to the elite. And I find that many people who are academics, many people would like to teach more and would like to spend more time on preparing their teaching, but they know that wouldn't be good for their career. And some people, they're not interested. They're not good teachers and they're not interested in becoming good teachers because, as I was told verbatim, well, no, actually, I was told in English, not in German, verbatim, well, those people who, who are interested, they will fight their way through it. My own teachings when I was a student, I didn't have good classes, and then I made it here, and so this is the same thing that we're going to offer to our students. And I sort of sit there going, okay, now I understand where you're coming from. At least you're being very open and honest about this. But that's the sort of thing that gets subjects slashed, institutes closed. And some people will say that that's not a big problem because what we need is STEM. That's what the world needs more engineers, needs more physicists, needs more doctors. And I say that, yes, that's very true that we need all of those, but you won't believe the number of people from STEM that I have in my courses that then they are doing very practical things with their lives, but they would also have they would like to have a little bit of meaning in their lives, beauty, sort of the bigger picture. And so I find it very important to draw in as many people as possible and to open the fields of research into the past, into other cultures, other literatures, other philosophies, to draw as many people into that as possible. I find that crucially important. And I'm saddened by the fact that increasingly it seems that this is not the purview of academia. So the academia is often for looking after an elite. In, for example, the US or the UK, it's a kind of financial elite because you've got these enormously huge tuition fees. In Germany, where I'm right now, I thought, oh, wonderful, it's a system without fees. This will be free. This will be egalitarian. This will be fair. And then I saw, no. We have other ways of keeping out the riffraff. I thought, but why would you want to do that? Oh, you're not a good teacher. Well, okay, that explains that then. You only want sort of the cream of the crop. You don't want to have the people who maybe need a little more explanation. And so, yeah, apologies. That was a rant that just needed to get out. But that's why I try to be the best teacher that I can.
No, that's brilliant and it's important. And it's this might be all of our third conversation, and it's sort of like an alternate version of what goes on in the back of my brain. There's so many points there. I mean, yeah, STEM, without question, STEM is useful for understanding and manipulation of the world. But whereby do we derive a worldview? Whereby do we turn inwardly? Whereby do we broach life's questions, meaning, purpose? Oh, we have all of this information. Whereby do we develop systems of filing and processing and prioritizing? Whereby do we develop a value system? Whereby do we benefit from the wisdom of ages? People who have struggled with the same BS that
Yeah,
humans have
exactly.
always struggled with, and they've figured stuff out, and they've been kind enough to leave it to us, often in lovely poetry, and
Yeah.
and so that is the humanities. And one of the greatest travesties of our time is that the humanities are going to hell in a handbasket right before our eyes. And I would cherish an appropriate professorship to whereby I could do what I'm here to do and nourish undergrads in an amenable department, et cetera, et cetera. However, every other day we're hearing of religious studies programs, majors, PhDs, entire programs merging, closing, for example. And I think that there's no one cause, obviously, and clearly the winds of change are upon us, and who can stop a tsunami? But there are antecedents to this. There are causes to this, and one of the greatest Achilles heels of the very mentality you're describing is, who cares about public engagement? Who cares about being user friendly? Who cares about impact? Well, then there's a reason why you're going the way of the dodo, right? So
Yeah,
I
yeah,
mean,
exactly.
I don't
And
think
sorry, go ahead.
no. Après
Um, oh, I didn't know we were vouvoying each other.
sure, why not?
um, uh, one thing that you just said really resonates with me when you said, I wish I could that there was a professorship for doing those things. That's what I used to think. Now I think, you know what? I have the impression that when it comes to really having student-focused classes where the only point is that I want to open up worlds for people, no matter what they're going to do with it, no matter whether they're going to then become graduate students, no matter whether they're going to major in my subject, where the only point is that I want to show you, look at all this wealth that we've got, is at this point definitely better than outside academia. So, and I really think that alt-ac is the future when it comes to the arts and humanities. Trad-ac, I wish was doing better, because that's what is, what's officially funded, where there's official strategies, where there's official systems in place. Anybody has heard of, I don't know, Cornell, Harvard, sort of University of Toronto or something like that. Whereas places like, the Indian Wisdom School or Yogic Studies, for whom I also teach, they're sort of, having to still advertise themselves and build up their name and build up their reputation. They're not hundreds of years old, but they're fairly new. But I feel that when you want to actually learn, they're so much better than universities, where all these systemic considerations come into play. So, for example, when I teach a university course, I need to make sure that the way that I evaluate people, the things that I give all my students, and the way in which I quiz them, test them, give them exam, is the same for everybody. So that I can then give them grades, which let them be compared to other people, which means that they can then go on into a higher seminar or not, they can get funding or a PhD place or not. That has nothing to do with, was I able to help each student, no matter where they are, advance with their particular Sanskrit or Latin or Greek or whatever knowledge as best I could. And there are students to whom I would give, completely different, depending on what kind of a person you are, what your interests are, what your background is, what your aims are. I would give you completely different recommendations or completely different resources, because I know that, or I think that these resources are going to be exactly what you need at this particular point. You need, one person wants and needs all the details. Another person wants and needs just sort of some skeletal information, because the rest they can fit in, they can just fill in themselves, because they've already learned, I don't know, Greek in the past, and so they just need a little bit here and there extra to do Sanskrit. In a class, I can't do that, because I'm supposed to treat everyone the same, so that I can then assess them, evaluate and give them grades that will allow them to be compared with others. I don't want my students to be compared with others. I want them to make the progress that they want to make. And that's what I can do, whenever I teach online. It's what I can do a lot less, for example, in university systems.
And utterly fascinating teaching philosophy. I've done a number of sessional contracts over the years with universities, typically online.
Mm-hmm.
We'll talk about online education in a moment, maybe 7 or 8, and I've quite enjoyed them. There are obvious limitations, some of which you mentioned, others having to do with whether or not they're interested in the course or pleasing mommy and daddy or just coasting and but really in 2010, just by some stroke of chance or diva, who knows, I landed a position teaching continuing studies, adult education at the University of Toronto, which has
Mm-hmm.
a vibrant hundreds of courses, and because it's a business for the university, right? So some smart cookie figured, okay, this is a great business idea, and that's their motivation. But they're also invested in hiring excellent instructors because it's good for their business model, but for my purposes, it's great for look, I'm teaching a bunch of adult learners who want to be here, who are giving up their precious time, their precious money to learn about comparative mythology, to learn about et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I guess hindsight is 2020, but it's you look back on your life thus far, and it's as if there's some authorship at play where this was the perfect preparation for me. Where the dream job was okay, professorship. This is what I was training for,
Mm-hmm.
and then I finished in 2015, late 2015, and America changed in 2016, and the job market was wretched. I was shortlisted. There was one position that I was offered, and it wasn't quite the right fit. My instinct was, to sort of hold back, and then I decided to entrepreneur out of necessity, out of sheer necessity. And then about 4 years later, by the time things shifted in America, I thought, well, do I really want to go to the middle of nowhere for a semester to live below the poverty line, or do I want to just continue the grind of attracting students who want to learn for learning's sake and do what I can to support or at least model something for other brilliant folks who are falling by the wayside. I can't tell you the
Mm-hmm.
number of U of T graduates from the PhD program who they're no longer at the academy because the jobs don't exist. And this is a huge problem. And so I think there are a number of things that are appealing about the current situation that people like yourself and myself and Seth Powell, who's founded Yogic Studies, we'll talk about that in a moment. I really want us to highlight what he's doing there. It's really brilliant, I think. I think there are a number of competing factors or complementary factors. One is um, the disintegration of the humanities to the academy. Two is the job market. Three, online education is here to stay and
Yeah.
has a certain I think status and credibility that it didn't always have, certainly not pre-pandemic. And so um, I think it's fantastic that folks like you are teaching online because what anyone who's interested can learn Sanskrit from you. So
Exactly.
tell
Yes.
tell us a bit about your experiences and your work, perhaps the program that you've developed at Yogic Studies. That'd be great to hear about.
Yeah. Um, so as an online teacher, I wish the world was flat and we didn't have time zones, because that is one of the problems that we regularly run into, finding a time that is actually good for everyone.
And not to mention daylight savings, and then
At
and they're
different
not the
times in
same.
different
Yes.
places.
Oh
And,
my goodness.
and also, if you're in different hemispheres, then when we spring forward, the Australians fall back, and all that. And yes, so last couple of weeks I've been teaching a course where one of my students regularly got up at 4 a.m. Sydney time to sit, to log in and to participate, because it was a course that was, for me it was in the evening. For the people in the East Coast, it was sort of mid-afternoon. For the people in the West Coast, it was sort of mid-morning. Sometimes we have people on Hawaii who then join in from very early in the morning, around the same time as kind of the Australians and the Kiwis, but there's a day ahead. It's almost the same time, but it's a day ahead. So the kinds of things that all of a sudden you need to take into account is absolutely fascinating. And I've been doing most of my online teaching at a place called Yogic Studies, founded by Seth Powell, whom you just mentioned. And it is this enormously vibrant and active online community that started out, hence the name, focusing on things relating to yoga. But it's basically extended to be a place where you can study so many aspects of the not just the Indian, but the subcontinent's history, past, culture. Also, many courses about aspects of modern life and modern society. And I am there as the Sanskrit instructor, so I do a 1-year course that's introductory Sanskrit and another 1-year course that's intermediate Sanskrit, and sort of 3 terms each. And I I love doing this because we now have the technical the technical tools that we need to do this quite well. So I'm not paid by Zoom to say this, but I love Zoom and the things that it lets me do. Which information I can share my browser, I can share a Word file, I can share one of their whiteboards, I can share videos, I can share audio, and so on and so on. So all these things that I wouldn't necessarily be able to share with my students in a classroom that easily. I can now just put on everybody's screen. If I was in a classroom, I would sort of need to project maybe or something like that. I would need everything as slides. Well, maybe some people who maybe other people actually do have this for their real life classes. But I find online it is a lot easier. Online also means that students, it doesn't matter whether they live close to a university, they can come, they can tune in. I always tell my students, to get comfortable, because if you're comfortable, if you're happy, you're more easily able to learn. If we were in a classroom and everybody brought their lunch, the olfactory impressions would be quite overwhelming. But if you're eating a snack while listening to me, perfectly possible. I remember I see the little thumbnails of my students on the screen, and I sometimes then see sort of cat tails going past, or I see someone who was just sitting in front of the screen. Now I see actually they're sort of leaning back on their sofa and they're knitting and they've got a drink next to them, and I'm like, yes, this is how I want you to feel, to be when you're in my class. I want you to be comfortable. I want you to be happy. And that is so much easier when you can just be, wherever you're happy naturally. You don't have to go to a classroom. It has the disadvantage that we're not in the same classroom together, not in the same physical space. So you can't just sort of go with your neighbor and say, hey, did you get that? Which is why it's important that we have spaces for students where they can, talk, where they can chat, where they can contact each other. But that's something that you can also set up online, and that's something that, for example, Yogic Studies has in spades. We've got study groups that were formed as part of a specific class that exist still years later. People often tell me, I'm part of the European group, and now I know, okay, what part of the European group means. But the first time I heard it, I thought, what is that political party? Is that a new social initiative I want to know about? Oh, right, you've got a Sanskrit study group. Wonderful. Okay, yeah. Yeah, so it's you can make it so that none of the disadvantages really play a role, and you can make it so that the possibilities that technology offers you make for a really nice student experience and also a really good teacher experience, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. Without trying, I was just a little ahead of the curve. I was literally on Zoom, teaching online on
Yeah.
Zoom out of my home office in 2017.
Okay, in my case, I first used Zoom 2018 or 19, I think. And then when the pandemic hit, I was among the first people, well, I think among the first people, at the university to suggest, maybe we should get a Zoom license because, teaching was going online. And then next thing I heard was that, oh, the university had bought Zoom licenses for everyone. I'm like, yes, perfect, good.
That's fantastic. And so maybe say a bit about the actual the program and the offerings of yogic studies,
Oh,
the curriculum
yes.
that you've designed there.
So first year, Sanskrit is there to introduce you to all the grammar, to a basic vocabulary, and to let you practice and apply that as much as possible while I'm still piling new things on every week. And the course is such that we have 3 terms of 12 weeks each, with sort of a month or so in between, a month or 4 weeks 5 weeks in between. And what we do is, at the beginning of the week, we send out an email that gives you access to all the information there. My online videos, my online flashcards, maybe references to specific websites, downloads for specific resources that I've created, so that you can go over everything in as much detail as you want over the weekend. And then Monday and Wednesday, we've got our live classes. And in those, I go through the material. I know, yes, I've given you the material so that you can look at it on your own, but I also want to make sure that I go through it with you in class. And what I do is I sort of talk for a couple of minutes, and then it's time for questions. Then I talk for a couple of minutes, and then it's time for questions. And I always make sure that I don't have anybody who feels that, oh, I didn't ask about this 8 weeks ago and now it's too embarrassing to ask. I always say, those are exactly the questions that I want you to ask me. Or if I can help you by doing something as simple as repeating myself, I am very happy to repeat myself. This is never a bad question to say, can you please say that again? I sometimes space out, when I listen to a talk that's really, really interesting, and then they say something interesting, which gets my mind going on a tangent, and then I missed what they said. And, in a sort of talk or something like that, in an academic talk, then you just, sort of suffer in silence. But no, in my classes, I want you to be able to think. And sometimes something isn't quite clear, or maybe sometimes, there's so many reasons why it may be helpful to repeat myself. So any kind of question goes. The only questions that are bad questions are the ones that you want to ask and don't for whatever reason. And so I really encourage people to, ask whatever it is they need to ask. And I always try to make sure that I answer those questions, not just by saying sort of yes, no, but by showing, well, these are the contexts in which this question is relevant. These are the ways in which you can answer this question for yourself next time you have a similar question. So that's the intro. We have weekly quizzes so that people can see what they already know. They can test themselves, see what they already know, see what they maybe want to look at again. We ask for submission of written work once a week, and the point of that work is not that it's perfect, but just that I want to see that you gave it a good go. And once you've submitted it, you get access to the exercise key so that you yourself can see, what did I get right? What did I get wrong? And I'm doing that because I know the normal thing is for the teacher to grade, to mark homework. But I found that that's very often just sort of for show. And you learn a lot more if you check your work yourself. You learn through the materials, through the classes, through doing the work, and then you learn again by checking your own work and maybe filling in any gaps that there still were. And I always say that, exercises are there to learn, not to perform. And that's basically the first year. We have midterms and finals for everybody who wants this, everybody who wants the little bit of the adrenaline kick that comes in with being worried about an exam, the sort of tests that allow you to see, have I gotten the big picture? But those are offered. And we are very, very flexible with them because basically we want them to be the kind of activity that you do that, you get out of whatever you want to get out of them in whatever way suits you best. And the second year is reading, reading, reading. So putting into action all the things that you're doing in the first year. The first year was about learning grammar. The second year is about applying all that grammar. And I always tell my students that at the end of the first year, if they feel that they don't know everything perfectly yet, unfortunately, that is completely normal. You only feel really comfortable with things. Things only really sort of settle in once you've started applying them regularly. How do you apply them regularly? You focus on reading texts. And so in the first term of the intermediate year, we read parts of book one and then the entirety of book two of the Bhagavad Gita. In the second term, we read epic. So which mostly is, well, of course, Bhagavad Gita is already part of an epic, but in the second term we read excerpts from the Ramayana. And for that we use my reader that I mentioned, because that's got lots of passages from the Ramayana annotated in such a way that they're exactly for this level of student, for this level of learning. And then in the third term, we read either the Katha, which I mentioned earlier, or there is another text that is as part of the same tradition, part of this Brihat Katha tradition, of this great story tradition, which is called the Brihat Katha Shloka Sangraha, the verse summary of the great story. We read, basically in one year we read Katha, and the next year we read from the Brihat Katha Shloka Sangraha, so that if students want to have more reading experience and just more reading fun, they can do the intermediate year twice if they want to, because the courses won't cover the same thing. But if they feel that, after the end of the intermediate year, they want to progress to higher things, that's where you have the 300 level, the advanced level, where we have all sorts of texts taught by different people. So we have courses on the Yoga Sutras, we have courses on Vedic texts, and soon we're going to have our first ever Kavya course, which I will be teaching, reading the first half of the Meghaduta by Candid.
Fantastic. That's it's such seems to be such an engaging and well-oiled machine at yogic studies. I said to Seth, I think a couple of years ago, that I don't ever plan on teaching Sanskrit grammar, because grammar is, I love Sanskrit, but I'm more of a user of the language. Currently, I have a colleague of mine. She has her own online platform. They teach various Vedic traditions, and she's had the Sanskrit class for 3 years, and she's asked me to take it over. So for the last 2 months, I've been teaching Sanskrit, and hilariously, I'll know the meaning of the word, but I have to relearn what the part of speech is. Oh yes, bhave prayog. Oh yeah, right, instrument. Yes, and it's sort of like, once you get to a certain space in a language, you're not identifying, you're just interpreting what the word is, and that's
Exactly, yes. I was asked by someone whether I could teach some German, and I said yes, but actually I'm quite apprehensive about it, because I'm just a native. I have never systematically studied German. I have done some, sort of teach yourself, because I've taught German in the past, and I knew that I now needed to get to know the systems. But, I just speak the language. But for many people, that is what you need in order to teach a language. But no, it is absolutely not.
no, thinking consciously about it. If I were there's no way I could possibly be so fluid and articulate while thinking consciously about parts of speech. So it's sort of one or the other. It's either you're studying scales or you're performing the symphony. You're not, so it's interesting. Language is an interesting thing, but it's really useful for me to re-engage consciously with the language in order to answer questions about the grammar. But what's missing is, what they're really thirsty for is fluidity. So now we are doing shlokas, we're practicing reading, we're practicing familiarity, so they can internalize the case endings, they can internalize this, and
Exactly,
that's
yes.
the real power. So you don't, like, what did you say you're doing? I think you said you're doing chapter 2 of the Bhagavad Gita, and I
Mhm.
mean, it's this beautiful symbolic opening of Arjuna, and watery Arjuna, who's son of Indra, tam tata kripayavishtam shipurna kollekshanam, Vishidantamidam vakyam uvacha madhusudana. You want to be you want to hear that and have a sense of what that is without thinking about nominatives and accusatives and
But
instrumentals.
so that you can get there, I always think of, grammar teaching as a ladder. And once you've climbed the ladder, then very often you just walk away, or you push the ladder down or whatever. You don't need the ladder anymore. But sometimes when you learn, when you read a text that is more difficult, more intricate, then you do need to remind yourself of your technical knowledge so that you can fully understand all the little details. There's this story of I forget if it's I think it was Yehudi Menuhin, the violinist, who said that he had this natural gift. He just knew how to play, but then at some point he hit a wall, and at that point he just couldn't get any better, couldn't get any further. And at that point he basically went back to the beginnings and taught himself consciously how to do all these things, how to do every single movement, every single technique. And then when he understood what he was doing, he understood what he needed to change, which element he needed to change, what he needed to do better. And that's how he then became the world-class violinist that we all know him as. And I think it's very often similar with language learning. Yes, some people sort of have a knack for languages, and other people sort of go, oh no, I don't really like them. But everybody, no matter what their natural disposition is, need to understand certain concepts, so that they can, when your natural instinct, your natural feel for something fails, you can then say, hang on, let me solve this problem, methodically.
Yeah, the conscious learning will only help your fluidity, like whether it's music, whether it's language,
Oh.
whether it's recipes. You mean, squinting and measuring the cinnamon or what have you 500 times, and then you can do it in your sleep. But it takes, unless you're some kind of culinary virtuoso, you're not going to channel how to make lasagna. You need to follow very specific rules, and then after a while maybe you can improv with your cooking. But it's really really fascinating. So it's really, I'm having this really rich experience where I haven't done Sanskrit grammar since I did a semester in Pune in 2012 was the
Mhm.
last I consciously did. I was so fortunate. I had no one else showed up for whatever reason for that. I had a semester of one-on-one tutoring with the AIIS in Pune in 2012. Yeah, the world was coming to an end, but it was okay because as long as I learned some of the Deva Bhasha, the language of the gods, before the end of the world, I'd be fine. But and so I'm having so much fun helping them with the fluidity, but also things are popping into my mind that I forgot were in there.
Mhm.
And it's great because it really is a new level of appreciation of how incredibly sophisticated and even organized the languages. And so we've talked about your fantastic programming at Yogic Studies, and let's announce for the audience that, and let's be clear, I deeply, obviously, both of us deeply value what you built at Yogic Studies, and we would never want to take away from that. We would only want to support that. It's a very well-oiled machine in terms of language training. However, now that the Indian Wisdom School is officially 3 years old, I'm not sure how that happened. It was an idea, and now it's like a thing. But anyhow, it's 3 years old now. um, we have invited our very first guest instructor, who is none other than Antonia, to teach a course not on Sanskrit grammar, but a course to offer some support on, well, without mastering Sanskrit, how do we figure out which texts, which translations? So I do this thing called Wisdom Wednesday, where it's basically satsanga. It's basically exegesis, close verse by verse exegesis on the Bhagavad Gita. We're now up to chapter 5, and I think we started at the beginning. So I think I've been doing it for 2-3 years now, every Wednesday. And we literally, because I don't do Sanskrit at the school, so I don't presume Sanskritic knowledge, many of the people who come, some of them are actually your students or they've studied elsewhere, but we literally have five translations. Okay. Like
Yeah.
whether it's Barbara Stoller Miller or a more poetic Rancor Prime, or we'll look at the Prabhupada, a little dogmatic, but at least he parses it, so the Sanskritist can follow along. We'll have 5 translations. And invariably we'll have to go back and I'll have to do some packing of the word when you see glaring differences in the English iterations. And this is a real problem. And so you've been kind enough to design a course to help address this very problem. So tell us about that.
Well, so I was really, really, I was and am really grateful that you're giving me the chance to teach this course because, obviously, if we all knew all the languages in the world fluently, that would be great. But it's just not realistic. Um, However, I feel that whenever it comes to learning languages, such as Latin, Greek, Sanskrit, or any of the other sort of cultural languages, Pali, so many of them, ancient Chinese, ancient Japanese, there's this idea that there are people who know them and people who don't know them. And I always, when someone asks me, do you know Sanskrit? I'm like, it depends on what you mean by know Sanskrit. Yes, I know what Sanskrit is. I've spent about 20 years of my life, 20 plus years of my life working with Sanskrit. But there are texts, when I look at them, I'm still stumped and I still need to think about what I'm doing and I need to look words up, or sometimes I need to, use my grammar and figure things out. And I want people to be aware that there are so many different levels to what it means to know a language. Yes, maybe it's perfect to be able to pick up a text and read it without any help. But what you can also do, and which is a lot less time intensive, requires a lot less commitment, and is sort of a great kind of a gateway drug if you ever wanted to do the full thing, is to understand the structures of the language, to understand the elements of the language that make it different from, for example, English, and that therefore make it difficult to translate texts into one authoritative English version. So I want to introduce students to some general thoughts about translation. What do we do when we translate? What kinds of translation are there? What aims may we have when we translate a text? And then I want to dive into the things that are within the Sanskrit language that may be difficult to render into English, and then what things there are within Sanskrit literary conventions that make Sanskrit potentially difficult to interpret and then to translate. And one of my favorite examples of this is, so for example, in the Bhagavad Gita, you have this one verse where Arjuna has just, said to Krishna, look, I don't know what to do. I'm supposed to kill all these people, but I don't want to kill them. Help. Yeah. And then it says that Krishna then replies to him, Prahasan Iwa. And this Prahasan is sometimes translated as he answers smiling. And sometimes it's translated as, he answers laughing, or even laughing out loud, bursting into laughter. And obviously, these are rather different reactions. And then, of course, independently from is he laughing out loud or is he smiling? The question would be, why is he laughing? Is he laughing at him or is he laughing with him? So those are the things that then are beyond just the language. Those are the interpretation. But what I then look at with my students is, how do we arrive at these different translations? How is it possible that professional printed translations of this text arrive at such very different wording? And so I tell them, we've got this verb hasati, which means to laugh, and we have this little, what we call a preverb. So it's prahasati. A preverb is just like in English, if I say, you can impel something, you can expel something. Im and ex are what we call preverbs. They just change the meaning of the word a little bit. And so pra is related to pro, which is Latin or Greek, and we have that in English. And so the pro can mean either pre, before, or it can mean pro in the sense of in front of, in public, visibly, clearly. And so depending on what you think the pra means, you then either think that he's before the stage of laughing, so he's smiling, or he is at the point of laughing out loud, laughing, visibly, guffawing loudly. And I'll then show you how you can access this information. So there is a list of these so-called preverbs that you can access and that you can see, okay, it can mean this, it can mean that. And so now I see how taking this verb to laugh plus this preverb can give me these different possible interpretations. And of course, it makes a really big difference. Is Krishna sort of smiling benignly because he knows what Arjuna is going through? Or is he laughing at him because, these puny human concerns are just so silly when you've got the perspective of a god? That makes a big difference in our understanding of the text and of Krishna. And it's a question of language that lets us make up our minds ourselves without having to depend on the mediation of a translator. And so I'll talk about systematic things like this. So how can we make preverbs work for us? Sanskrit is big on compounds, so nouns like I don't know, a treehouse or toothpaste or sword fight. So these words that are several words doing one thing. What are the problems with translating those? Where are the ambiguities coming from in there? And how can I say, okay, I'm looking at this compound, and actually there are 4 different main possibilities for how I may need to translate it. If I understand these 4 possibilities, then I can figure out pretty much every compound in the Bhagavad Gita and see, could mean this, could mean that, could mean that, could mean that. And now let me figure out from the context what it most likely does mean or what it has to mean. Things like that I want to tell people about. So yes, we will be talking about language. We will be talking about sort of the systems in the language, but rather than asking of anyone to, do lots and lots and lots of memorization of all these different forms, no, we're not going to do any of that. I'll show you some basic, I'm almost tempted to call them tricks of how to work out for yourself. This is the inherent ambiguity. This is the inherent fuzziness of what the Sanskrit is saying. And these are the ways in which I may resolve the issue. These are the ways in which I may translate this text. And then the question of, or this word. And then the question of how, well, yes, but so there are these 4 possibilities. Great. How do I know which one to choose? So we'll talk about that. What kinds of experience, what kinds of thinking you need to put into to either choose the right thing, or usually you'll read it. You'll be working with a translation of a text, such as the Gita, and you'll see what the author has chosen. But now you'll be able to understand why the author chose this and why this wasn't a random choice to translate smile or laugh out loud, but what the constraints were on the author, what the possibilities of the translator, what the possibilities were that the translator was facing, and which possibility the translator then chose. And you'll understand what the translator did, and then you can see for yourself, which of these do I think, convinces me most? That's what I'll be trying to get people to do.
Brilliant. This is certainly a course that I wish I had.
Well, good news.
One question that comes to mind is how much Sanskrit, if any, is required for students who might be interested in the course?
None. This is, if you speak a language, and I assume that if you come to the course, you do speak a language. If you didn't speak a language, or if you didn't speak English, it would be difficult for you to follow the course because I will be speaking English with you. So if you know English, you'll be fine. This is where I want to sort of pick you up, and then I want to show you, I just gave you sort of a little summary. So this may sound really sort of technical, but I will gently lead you up to all of these technical issues within the 4 meetings that we have.
Brilliant. And so these there are 4 parts of the course, 4 modules, and the course is Wednesday, I believe.
Thursday, I think.
Thursdays in May, 4 Thursdays in May, 9, 16, 23rd, and 30th. Do folks, if folks can't make the slot because the world isn't flat and we have all these time zones, is it fine if they follow along by recording and
Oh,
connect with
absolutely, yes. So the course will be recorded, and the recording, you will make it available. This is something that I just completely forgot to mention for yogic studies earlier. Yes, everything is recorded, everything is available, because at this point this comes so automatically to me. So yes, if you can come to the course live, that is great, because then you can ask me questions and I can respond to them right away. But if you can't make any session live, or also if you can't make any of the sessions live, they will be recorded, they will be made available, and so that should definitely not keep you from enrolling if you're interested in what the course is about.
Fantastic. So, any of you who might, be interested in all things Indic, but have little or no Sanskrit, and perhaps you're looking at the Yoga Sutras in translation, or the Bhagavad Gita, or maybe even some Kavya, the Mahabharata, the Ramayana, and you come across various translations, and you want to make sense of which translation you feel would be best without having to master Sanskrit, then this course definitely is for you. So it is linked in the podcast notes. The school's URL is indianwisdomschool.com. It's actually called Sanskrit in Translation. And I've just, as we were speaking, created a coupon code for anyone listening. We obviously, Antonia and I firmly believe in making things as accessible as possible. So for any of you who want to benefit with the code Sanskrit 2024, you can have it for 25% off. If you have other financial concerns, by all means, money's only ever a means. It's never an end, at least for me. By all means, get in touch. We'll see what we can do to enroll you. I'm not hard to find. rajbalkaran.com. Fantastic. So I'm so looking forward to you running this course and it creating this impact for various students who are only going to benefit in their studies of all things Indic through these, as you say, tricks, but the tricks of the trade. They really are. I mean, it would take a great deal for someone to learn how to do this. So that's wonderful to avail this shorthand method of deciphering translations, which is a real problem for those who don't have Sanskritic chops. Is there anything else about your work, the yogic studies, this course, your teachings elsewhere, really anything else at all that you would like us to touch on before we close?
Well, one thing that I'm quite excited about, apart from teaching this course that we've been talking about, is I am currently finishing up a manuscript for a little Vedic reader that I've been working on with a former teacher of mine. It's a collection of Vedic passages, Vedic quotes. And when I say Vedic, I sort of mean, the full breadth. So from the Rig Veda to the Brahmanas to the Upanishads. It contains the text. It contains, so we've got a German and an English translation. So depending on what's better for you, you just use that. There's a complete vocabulary. There's grammar notes, and there will also be a handout from me that I'll just make available on my website, antoniaruppel.com. And it feels so weird saying that. I have a website, antoniaruppel.com. That is a thing now. I will make available a handout that basically guides anybody who knows classical Sanskrit but would like to do Vedic. It guides them into that. So I'll make use of the things that you know because you've studied Sanskrit, and then I'll tell you, okay, now these are the different things you'll need to know so that you can start reading Vedic texts. And I'm quite excited to be working on this. We were talking about humanity, the human family, and human traditions. This collection that is contained in this reader is actually one that was made by two generations of professors at the University of Erlangen here in Germany. And the former teacher with whom I'm editing this collection and publishing this collection, he was basically their student and their successor. So it's, the wisdom of three generations of academics that has gone into this. And then now I'm profiting from it, and I'm sort of I've entered the fray, and I'm helping publish it. And it's just there's so many wonderful quotes in there, so many sort of one-liners where you sort of go, wait, it says that in the Vedas? Okay, right. Well, I guess that's not a new finding. That's 3,000 years old then. Okay, right. And so it's going to be called Veda Sätze / Vedic sentences, and hopefully it's going to be out within the next sort of 3 or 4 months.
Fantastic. Whenever it is out, or at least orderable, let us do a deep dive into that, and we can
Oh, I
highlight
would
that
love
once
that.
again on New Books Network. That'd be great. It's been so great speaking with you about your
Likewise.
love of language, about your view on pedagogy, and I'm you know we've had some. By the way, I quite love the Antonia Ruppel.com initiative. I mean, is this the first time you're announcing it? I don't know, but we chatted about this, I think, some months ago. And we're like, we need to secure a URL. And it turns out you already had it.
You know what? Fun story. Yes, exactly. I went online and I thought, okay, I need a website for myself. And some idiot had reserved antoniaruppel.com.de and some others a long time ago and done nothing with these URLs. And then I realized, oh yeah, that was me. Okay, great. Now I can use them.
Yeah, fantastic. No, it's great. And this is what you're doing, what Seth's doing, what
What
this
you
Raj,
are doing.
what Raj Balkaran, what this weirdo is doing. This is the way of the future. It's of necessity. How else do we keep this learning alive? I
Yeah,
mean,
exactly.
this is, we're just ahead of the curve. That's all, and we're creating space and hopefully examples for others to follow in the humanities, whether in Sanskrit studies or beyond. So fantastic. So for those of you listening, we of course have been speaking with Dr. Antonia Ruppel. All of her links, including her brand new website, antoniaruppel.com, are in the podcast notes. Check out her language training at Yogic Studies. Check out her fantastic language resources, the Cambridge Introduction 2017 and the 2021 Brill Sanskrit Reader. And if you're at all interested in learning how to choose which English translation to use for your personal study or teaching, then by all means come study with her at the Indian Wisdom School, indianwisdomschool.com. Until next time, keep well, keep listening, and keep contemplating the beauty and power and meaning availed by this ancient tongue called Sanskrit. Take care.